Hey, this is Mark Rogers, the voice of college football, teaming up with SD1 Sports to get you set for SEC football in 2019 and 5 reasons why Georgia will win the SEC in 2019. Reason number 1 is talent. Kirby Smart has done a tremendous job on the recruiting trail. Mark Richt built a top 10 to 15 roster. Kirby Smart has upgraded that to elite status, ranking with Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State as the best recruiting classes in the nation. All right, the Tide is still number 1 and has been number 1 for a number of years in recruiting. However, by many measurements, Georgia has caught Alabama, and by some measurements, in regards to talent brought into the program, has exceeded Alabama. Take into consideration over the last 2 recruiting cycles, Georgia and Kirby Smart has brought in 12 5-stars. Alabama, guess how many 5-stars Nick Saban has brought in the last 2 recruiting cycles? 5. 12-5, Georgia with the advantage in terms of elite talent brought into the program over the last 2 years in comparison to Alabama. Of course, Alabama has defeated Georgia in 2 championship games over the last 2 years, and one of the big reasons why, after Georgia had double-digit leads in both games, Alabama depth wore them down in the fourth quarter, late in the fourth quarter. So this is the most complete Georgia roster we will see. The top-end talent was young. It was in the freshman and sophomore and junior classes. Now it's over the complete roster, and Georgia should be much better prepared with the roster depth, not just the top-end talent, to deal with Alabama in a championship game. Reason number 1 why Georgia will win the SEC in 2019 is top-end talent. Reason number 2, the Dogs will prevail in 2019 is Jake Fromm. Jake Fromm has been labeled as a game manager. Well, what does that mean? That means that the offense relies on the running game first and foremost, and that the quarterback should not mess up the game, and the team should be able to win if he just doesn't mess up the game. Well, it is true that Georgia does rely on its stable of running backs and has over the last several years to win football games and win the big games. Also, because Jake Fromm is not a dynamic runner, people label him as a game manager without that varied skill set. But let's take this into consideration. Jake Fromm completed over 67% of his passes last year with 30 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. Those are not the stats of a game manager, even though Georgia had many big leads in the fourth quarter in which he was out of the game or did not have to play. Also take into consideration that Jake Fromm, in the 2 biggest games for Georgia last season against Florida and Alabama, he pulled through in spades. Against Florida, consider that the Gators, had they won that game, would have won the SEC Eastern Division with both teams going 6-2. The Gators led in the second half, and Jake Fromm pulled through with a 70% completion percentage, 3 touchdowns against Florida. And then in the SEC championship game, not Jake Fromm's fault, he built a 28-14 lead. He put up 28 points against Alabama in much less than 60 minutes of football, throwing for 301 yards and 3 touchdowns and no interceptions against the Tide. The game was taken out of his hands. Alabama came back and won. But in Jake Fromm and Georgia's 2 biggest games of 2018, he played exceptionally well. And if you go back to the college football playoff in 2017, trailing by as many as 17 points against Oklahoma, Jake Fromm, when he needed 2 drives in the fourth quarter, or they lose and go home at the Rose Bowl, he pulled through with key throws to pull that game out, send the game to overtime, and win it over Oklahoma. Jake Fromm plays in the clutch, and look at the NFL prospectus. He is not only considered a first-round pick at this point, but in many top 10s, and there are also some legitimate services out there that project him as the number 1 selection in the NFL draft. What's that have to do with college football? Well, game managers aren't selected number 1 in the NFL draft. Jake Fromm is an exceptional elite quarterback. Reason number 2 why Georgia will prevail in the SEC in 2019 is Jake Fromm. Reason number 3, Georgia wins the SEC in 2019 is Kirby Smart. Yes, he's built a great program. He took over a really good program, and he's raised it to elite status with the aforementioned recruiting efforts. Kirby Smart has also made his mistakes on the sideline. The biggest blunder, the most noticeable one, of course, in the SEC championship game against Alabama. tie game, midfield, goes for it on 4th and 9. Well, poorly designed play, bad situation. It was too long of an effort to try to pick up 9 yards. Alabama kept its defense on the field, and Kirby Smart still pulled the trigger and thought Justin Fields could get the 9 yards. Poorly designed play, wrong situation, and he shouldn't have pulled the trigger. Bad decision by Kirby Smart. Go back to the LSU game. Not that the Bulldogs would have won this game, but it was very early. They were only down 3-0, a game they eventually lost by 19 points. Well, they go for a fake field goal. In that situation, he's relying on the kicker to outrun the LSU special teams, which is crazy. Some of the fastest athletes in the country. Poorly designed play, poor situation again. Kirby Smart made a mistake. He's done this a few times in a few situations, but you would expect him to learn from these situations. He did not prepare his team for a rebound off the letdown against Alabama, in which they missed the college football playoff and lost the SEC championship, to rebound and play a big game against Texas in the Sugar Bowl. They were flat. They were outplayed. They didn't show up. Well, that's happened to other great coaches. Just look at Nick Saban. 2008, they could have went to the national championship game. Instead, they lost to Florida in a close SEC title game. They continued to let down, and they got trampled by Utah in the Sugar Bowl. Then in 2013, after being struck down by the kick six in Auburn and failing to get to the BCS championship game, Alabama laid an egg at the Sugar Bowl against Oklahoma. So it happens to coaches, but I believe Kirby Smart has learned his lesson. Game management, game situations, he needs to make the wise decision. Also, how to better prepare his team. Believe me, Kirby Smart is learning from his mistakes, and he is rounding out his game on the sideline to match his other coaching acumen. Reason number 3 that Georgia will win the SEC in 2019, Kirby Smart learning from his mistakes. Reason number 4 that Georgia will prevail in the SEC in 2019 is that Alabama plays in the SEC Western Division. Of course, they've got to go through LSU, Auburn, and Texas A&M, and Mississippi State in particular. Georgia, despite Dan Mullen's efforts, after just 1 and 2 recruiting cycles and 1 good season under Florida's belts, they're still not at the level that Georgia is in regards to what we talked about with Georgia versus Alabama the last few years in terms of roster depth of talent. So Georgia is still by far significantly the best team in the Eastern Division. They should have less stress, less wear and tear on them running through the East than Bama does through the West. They will arrive in Atlanta fresher, more focused, more prepared, less worn down, theoretically less injuries, and ready to play the SEC championship game. So reason number 4 that Georgia will win the SEC championship is that they've got an easier ride to Atlanta than the Western Division winner. And finally, reason number 5, Georgia will win the SEC in 2019 is that there's typically a natural progression to get to a championship. You see this in sports all over the place, especially in football. Most of your championship football teams just didn't go from 8 wins to a championship. There's a progression. There's a learning curve. There's building blocks to be undertaken to get to that level. We see it over and over in the NFL in particular. Teams hit the brick wall of losing playoff games, maybe then getting to the conference championship game and losing before they break through. There's a process. The coach is learning. The players are learning. They're also learning how to win, and they're gelling as a program and as a unit. Reason number 5, Georgia will win the SEC and go on to the college football playoff is that they are learning and they will have a breakthrough in 2019. All right. Our 5 reasons why Georgia will win the SEC in 2019. Would love to hear what you have to say about the Bulldogs' chances against Alabama and the rest of the SEC to get to the college football playoff this fall. Lock it down to SG1 SEC, and we will see you next time.